It's 17th of June, 1709. King Charles XII and his experienced Swedish army had been stuck for 6 weeks attempting to capture the fortified town of Poltava, as the stubborn Russian garrison refused to yield. Things did not look good for the Swedes. The unbearable summer heat drained the men. Wounds festered, and many were taken by gangrene. Worse for the Swedes, Tsar Peter I, later known as Peter the Great, was amassing an army to relieve Poltava and engage in a decisive confrontation with Charles. The future of Russia was about to be decided on the banks of the Voskla River. This video is sponsored by Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus. Now let me start by saying that this is not your usual mobile game. Developers took great care in establishing key pillars for the game to make your experience fun and immersive. Under the hood, the game is fantastic. Fast-paced and yet engaging tactical battlefield gameplay and PvE campaigns in the palm of your hand. You can play at your own pace and truly enjoy the game to the fullest as you unlock new stuff without spending money. Not forcing microtransactions on the players is an impressive show of restraint by the devs. The classic Warhammer 40,000 champions, over 60 of them that you can collect and upgrade from 15 playable factions. Character and unit design that looks identical to the tabletop models that experienced fans will definitely appreciate. Focus on forming a passionate community of gamers and Warhammer fans. It truly feels like you're always accomplishing something. Fight against or strategize with other players in tightly competitive PvP battles and also in massively collaborative boss fights under your guild banner. In simple terms, Tacticus is the definitive tactical mobile game for Warhammer 40,000 fans set in the grim darkness of the far future. And the devs work on making the game a lasting success by listening to the feedback of its community, along with constantly fresh content, exciting features, new game modes, and challenging events. By all metrics, Tacticus is now the go-to game for top-quality mobile tactical gaming. The recent expansion, Adeptus Mechanicus, introduced a wealth of new content. And speaking of new content, a new faction is already being worked on. I won't share any spoilers, but it will be a banger, so stay tuned. Conquer the tactical battlefields of the far future by downloading Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus from the App Store, Google Play, or Samsung. By clicking my link below, you help my channel and get to enjoy everything that this gem of a game has to offer. Of the 3 nations that attacked the Swedish Empire of Charles XII, only one had never sued for peace: Tsar Peter I's Russia. Time and time again, the coalition attempted to beat the Swedish in an everlasting conflict that would become known as the Great Northern War. In 1700, the Danes were forced to surrender after a daring Swedish landing which eventually led to Charles threatening the capital itself. As that campaign ended, he turned back to the Swedish possessions in Estonia, where the fortress of Narva had been besieged by a 37,000-strong Russian army. Despite being outnumbered almost 3-1, he routed the Russians and relieved the garrison. It was with this victory that Charles formed a low opinion of the Russian troops that he would carry with him for years. While the Russians withdrew to lick their wounds, he turned south to Poland. There he met strong opposition from Augustus the Strong, with his combined Saxon and Polish troops, sometimes rebuffed by contingents of Russians. Multiple times the Swedish Carolean army of King Charles routed the numerically superior foe in many a great battle. From 1701 to 1706 he scored several decisive victories in the battles of the Duna, Klishów, Pultusk, Warsaw, Praga, and Grodno. his talented commanders gaining several more in addition. With this brilliant campaign, the army had effectively neutralized both Poland and Saxony. In 1706, Augustus would defeat a combined army of pro-Charles Poles and regular Swedish troops at the Battle of Kalisz. However, the victory was effectively rendered moot as Charles' diplomacy intervened, neutralizing Poland-Lithuania from taking significant action again and placing Stanisław Leszczyński on the Polish throne. This effectively left Tsar Peter on his own, but he did not sit idle as the main Swedish army campaigned in the west. The Russian Tsar recognized Charles's neglect for grand strategy. Taking advantage of the vulnerable Swedish garrisons in Estonia and Livonia, Peter would vigorously campaign in this region for the next few years. By 1704, he would finally capture the fortress of Narva, the scene of Russia's greatest blunder back in 1701. With the capture of Narva, he severely threatened the rest of the region, whilst giving his rustic troops valuable battlefield experience. Only after fighting a brutal guerrilla war against Polish peasants, already destitute from the Russian army's march, would the king finally begin his invasion of Russia with 44,000 men. Up until then, the largest army ever fielded by Sweden. He first pursued General Sheremetev past the Vistula, following him skillfully through the nigh impassable Masovia region. He planned that if he combined his army with that of the capable General Adam Ludwig Leeuwenhaupt, encamped in Livonia, he would be able to match the Russians in numbers and garner enough supplies for the campaign. A successful campaign could possibly result in the capture of either St. Petersburg or Moscow, which he believed would be enough to force Russia to capitulate once and for all. But as he chased Prince Menshikov into Russia, he found himself opposing an army of 50,000 men in a defensive line stretching along the Dnieper. The direct road to Moscow had been placed under guard of General Sheremetev, while Peter himself held the road to St. Petersburg. Charles's Chancellor, Count Piper, argued for a swing north towards Peter's new beloved city. Doing so would result in the Russians abandoning both Livonia and Estonia, for such an offensive might result in the occupation of St. Petersburg. In addition, this would most likely provide a closer line of supply and communication to Finland. Thus, it would not carry as much risk for the small but veteran Karelian army, an irreplaceable army that could not afford to suffer even just one disaster. However, Charles showed no interest in this plan. The king was more interested in a drive to the, at the time, more historically significant city of Moscow. This would require him to cross the great river gate that the Russians occupied in strength. Although the king's plan was not without reason. The Dvina, Dnieper and Berezina rivers and their tributaries would provide great obstacles at first, but as the rivers continued, they both turned eastward to Moscow, opening up a corridor to Smolensk, which was undefended by any further significant bodies of water. Finally, Charles marched out from the Minsk area on June 6th, leaving a garrison of 5,000 men behind in Poland. As the Swedes advanced toward the Berezina, they encountered the 8,000-strong cavalry division of General Goltz on June 15th. Charles detached the advanced guard under Major General Axel Sparre, which pinned Goltz down at Borisov. After quickly crossing through the wetlands, the Swedes put down their pontoon bridges and crossed with no issue. However, Goltz managed to make an orderly withdrawal under the cover of rain across the Drat. Charles took it upon himself to relentlessly pursue the Russian horsemen, beating back their screens of Cossacks and dragoons, yet never luring the division into open battle. On June 30th, the main Swedish army reached the Varbich tributary. On the other side, he could see defensive works before the town of Holoaksin. It was Repnin's division of Sheremetev's army. On July 3rd, he personally led his men through a marshy swamp that the Russians considered impassable and attacked under the cover of darkness. Repnin's division was routed, and the battle inflicted around 2,000 Russian casualties, for half that number of Swedes killed or wounded. Although they had been ambushed and forced to retreat, Sheremetev put up a stubborn rearguard and managed to formulate an orderly withdrawal, the first showing of how the Russian army matured. Come July 7th, the victorious Charles entered Mogilev. There he rested his men and waited for the arrival of Leeuwenhoup's army, which had been delayed by muddy roads and appalling weather. After 4 weeks, there still was no sign of the army from Livonia, so a concerned Charles reluctantly continued on. This trend continued until Charles had come to the very walls of Smolensk. The Russian people, unaware of the severe issues facing their enemies, panicked. Many evacuated from Moscow, but the Swedish king, influenced by increasing desertions and a lack of supplies, was instead forced to march south into the unguarded region of Severia on September 15th. In order to control the region, he would need to capture 3 fortresses. The first, Mglin, was taken with ease. However, Starodub was narrowly missed as a result of poor communication, so the Russians were easily able to garrison the 2 remaining fortresses. A fast march south was supposed to provide a moment of respite, but he now had nowhere to go, and the constant drum of marching and fighting had effectively reduced the army from 44,000 down to 30,000 men. However, in late October, Charles finally made contact with Leeuwenhaupt, but when his troops marched into camp, they looked as if they had been beaten, and this wasn't far from the truth. It turns out that Leeuwenhaupt had been intercepted outside the village of Lisnaya on the 9th with his entire army and baggage train. All the supplies had been lost, and Leeuwenhaupt's forces were reduced to half their strength. His defeat seemingly quashed all but one opportunity to take Moscow. However, when word came of the Swedish invasion, the influential Cossack hetman Ivan Mazepa had declared open rebellion against the Tsar in favor of Charles XII. Now the exhausted Karelian army would have to move into Ukraine, link up with the friendly Cossacks, and go into winter quarters. Only then could Charles use this unlikely opportunity to drive north. Throughout October, the Karelians fought their way to Ukraine and the city of Baturin. Cossack light cavalry loyal to Peter shadowed their every move. There was not a day without an ambush. When they arrived, the city had already been razed by Prince Menshikov, whose forces massacred 15,000 Cossack rebels and civilians. Yet with the help of the locals, Charles would force the Russian column south of the smoldering Baturin. The 2 armies paused and settled in for a harsh winter. Despite the change in season, the generals already began drafting plans for the next campaign. Charles wished to eject the Russians from the river Vorskla, while Peter employed a strategy of containment, blocking the Swedes from advancing on Kursk or Kharkov. One of the outposts enforcing this strategy was the key town of Poltava. By spring, the Swedish Cossack army had reached its lowest point. The Swedish army had marched hundreds of kilometers through an unfamiliar country, fought a major battle, fought off countless raids, endured the century's worst winter, gone through intense labor and starvation. Charles's army was now reduced to 24,300 men. The only thing that could be done was to bring the Russians out and destroy them. First, Charles besieged the 6,800-strong garrison of Poltava in preparation for a drive to Kursk on May the 1st. However, on June 16th, the Russian army finally crossed the Vorskla successfully. The next day, Charles would be struck by a stray bullet during a visit to one of the siege lines, depriving the Karelians of their most beloved and charismatic king as their primary commander. Field Marshal Rheinfeldt told the king that there was enough gunpowder and ammunition for one major battle, the last chance to crush the Russians and drive on Moscow. There would be no withdrawing or scorching of the earth this time by Peter, for the decisive battle of the Great Northern War had come. Before midnight on June 27th, the whole Swedish army knelt for prayer before moving on to the Russian camp north of Poltava. With Charles being carried around on a stretcher, command of the infantry went to General Leeuwenhoek. The cavalry went to Field Marshal Rheinfeldt, the victor of Fraustadt in 1706. During their deployment to the battlefield, they found a portion of the Russian army entrenched in a series of fortified redoubts. On the rear flanks lie two streams, fortified by dragoons and light troops, who took cover behind charred buildings and the dense woods. In the dry ground between the two streams lie the previously mentioned 10 redoubts formed into the shape of the letter T, garrisoned by 4,000 infantry and 16 light guns. The positioning of the redoubts between the two streams made them completely impossible for the Swedes to bypass, as they would be caught into an enfilading fire on all sides. Thus, it would be imperative to deal with them one by one, resulting in the dedication of already weakened battalions from the rest of the battle. The Russians had 42,000 infantry, Cossacks and cavalry, along with 73 guns to defend the redoubts and the whole position. In stark contrast, Leeuwenhoek just had 8,200 infantry and Rheinfeldt 7,800 cavalry. Another 2,000 men had been posted to defend the baggage train further south, and a meager 1,100 were left to surround Poltava. 1,800 cavalry were posted further south from the battlefield. The Swedes could count on only 4 cannon, as the others were being used on the siege lines, or they lacked the means to transport the rest. In addition, the Karelians relied on 1,000 Polish irregulars to screen the Cossacks in the Yakovetsky woods. The overall Swedish plan relied on the superiority of the Swedish arms. Leeuwenhoek's infantry were to move through the redoubts, chase the fleeing troops north, and ideally their panic could sow chaos in the Russian camp and compel it to rout, with their only option of escape being to cross the river or move along its banks. This plan depended entirely on the immobility of the Russians, the superiority of the Swedes, element of surprise, and momentum. On the opening hour of June 28th, the Swedish infantry and irregulars completed their deployment about 1 kilometer south of the redoubts. However, it took 2 more hours for the cavalry to fully deploy. When they did arrive, the Swedes could hear the axes and saws of the Russian troops going to work. They were awakening. The delay endangered the whole element of surprise. Yet Charles, stubborn as ever, decided that the attack would go through anyway. At 3:45 a.m., he allowed Rheinfeldt to give the fateful order. "In the name of God, then, let us go forward." The 18 battalions, supported by a battery of 4 guns, advanced as quietly as possible in the early morning darkness. It seemed that the element of surprise had not been totally lost at first, until a shot broke the eerie silence. More shots from Russian sentries triggered the sound of bugles and a beat of drums. Surprise had vanished. With no time to lose, the Dalarna and Västerbotten regiments quickly overran the first redoubt, killing nearly all the defenders. The attack had begun in a daze of confusion. Next, the 2 battalions of Närke Värmland regiment would lead the assault onto the second redoubt, taking it easily as well. The column then turned its attention toward the third, whose garrison had more time to prepare. Instead of another easy victory, the Värmlanders were instead met with a great salvo from the garrison. For a moment the regiment was stuck fighting desperately in the redoubt's ditch, until it recoiled in disorder into the Jönköping regiment that had been following. The 2 regiments rallied and made a second attack, but were once again repulsed with heavy losses. Slowly, more regiments from the other columns found themselves in tunnel vision with the third redoubt, halting their advance to instead try to overrun it. General Roos took command of these 6 battalions, so the rest of the army could move on, taking in regiments that were supposed to move with the other 12. On the Swedish right wing, the 4th column, led by Löwenhaupt himself, found themselves in front of the bulk of the Russian dragoons, which Prince Menshikov led. The dragoons saddled toward the infantry, vulnerable in their incomplete formations. A call for cavalry gradually turned into a cry for help from their comrades. Answering the cry, the right-wing Swedish cavalry, under the command of Major General Kreutz, gallantly charged forward. However, Menshikov's dragoons would put up an unexpectedly high level of resistance as the Scandinavian horsemen attempted to break them again and again. It was only with orders from the Tsar that Menshikov reluctantly fell back with his wing. Löwenhaupt kept with his orders and followed the now pursuing cavalry, swinging his men around the redoubts to avoid the fire. Meanwhile, the left-wing cavalry under the Scottish-born Major General Hamilton picked their way around the rear line of redoubts and, despite losing some cohesion, launched themselves straight at the waiting Russian cavalry. In stark contrast to the action on the left wing, he drove them back after a sharp melee. It was now 4:30 a.m., and Rhienfeldt's left-wing cavalry had chased the dragoons north of Poltava. While the cavalry battle had overall gone well for the Swedes, the infantry line slowly continued to deteriorate. On the left, only the Västmanlands infantry regiment had been able to break through with the left-wing cavalry. This meant that the rest of the infantry were on the right flank with Löwenhaupt, or still caught up on the redoubts with Roos. Even Löwenhaupt couldn't pass the line completely, and ordered the Uppland regiment to break through yet another redoubt of the rear line. They would do so in gallant fashion, but sustain a heavy loss of life. And even then, only 10 battalions had successfully passed the forts. It was now around 5:30 a.m., and General Löwenhaupt wished to continue on, but he was halted by Marshal Rhienfeldt, who told him to regroup with the returning cavalry and all the infantry. It was discovered that a third of the infantry was still missing, and little did they know they would never be seen again. At the third redoubt, the Närke Värmland, Jönköping, Dalarna and Västerbotten regiments had been making repeated assaults to carry the position all morning, but none were successful. The army lacked ladders, their cannon that had been captured in the confusion, or any siege equipment, and now heaps of their dead lay in the surrounding ditch. Many times the Swedes reached the very edges of the redoubt's walls, only to be repulsed by the withering enemy fire. Rus knew there was nothing else he could do, and the troops withdrew. Of the 2,600 men that attacked the redoubt, 1,000 now lay dead or severely wounded. Rus would take them to the edge of the Yakovetsky Wood to regroup, but discovered he now lost communication with the rest of the army. Neither command was aware of where each other had gone. Rus's men were not safe yet, however. Seeing that his column was isolated, Lieutenant General Rentzel quietly marched 5 battalions and 5 dragoon regiments through a concealed passage, while they could catch Rus off guard. Unaware of this, Rus kept up his search for survivors and anyone from the main army. And just when they thought they had disengaged, the exhausted Swedes were now forced to fight for their very lives. Rus did what he could, forming his line in a crescent shape to counter the crossfire, but high casualties in the officer ranks created an atmosphere of poor command and cohesion. The casualty rate for the officers was so high that non-commissioned officers, who usually lead platoons or squads, acted as company and even battalion commanders. This level of disorder, combined with the salvos of fresh Russian troops, broke the Karelians. The Darlana regiment clung on long enough only for a few of the other men to escape. Rus, fighting off attacks from stray Russian soldiers, guided his few remaining men toward the siege lines, halting at an abandoned redoubt that he placed them inside. The men fortified the desolate redoubt, but as Rentzel approached, he offered surrender. Rus knew there was nothing left he could do, and surrendered. A whole third of the Swedish infantry, 2,100 men, had been cut off and destroyed, even though the main phase of the battle had yet to begin. A half-hour prior, the Tsar had been informed of the successful attack on Rus's column. As he held a council of war with his generals, the Swedish cavalry were spotted moving from the area they chased the Russian right-wing cavalry to, the area known as the Great Ouvrage. Their plan was to reunite with the infantry and attack the main camp, negating the superior numbers of the Russian infantry by providing flanking cover. Peter acted fast, deploying 22,000 of his infantry in 2 lines outside of the camp, a staggering 42 battalions. General Bauer's 9,000 dragoons deployed to their right, and another 4,800 slipped away from the Ouvrage and began deploying on the left. The Swedes could only match the 42 battalions with a meager 10, as 2 had been sent back in search of the lost troops. No one had any idea where Rus's column had gone, and their cavalry was forced to form the reserve behind the infantry. Most other armies would have retreated in the face of such odds, but not Charles. He very much believed the bayonets of his Karelians would carry the day, and really, there was no other choice. He was surrounded. Both sides just 800 meters from each other, Peter rode up and down the line as following Orthodox priests sprinkle holy water by the regiments who poured from the camp. Every Swedish soldier could only stare at the mass in front of them. They would go forward, and they knew that they were about to die. At 9:45 a.m., Rheinfeldt ordered Lievenhaupt to advance. The beat of drums and the sound of bugles echoed throughout the Swedish line. First, the heavy guns in the Russian camp belched flame, but their fire had more of a psychological effect, as they often missed. It was the 77 regimental guns lined up in the ranks of the battalions that would prove far more devastating. The solid shot blew gaping holes in the ranks, tearing off heads, limbs, cutting men in half, and spilling entrails. When the Swedes came within 200 meters, the gunners switched to canister shot, a type of ammunition that had the effect akin to a shotgun blast rather than a solid ball. As the red-clad gunners fired, Swedish men fell in scythes as the guns blasted apart the ranks of leading battalions. As they came within musket range, the Russian infantry answered with a thunderous musket salvo. The Swedish line lost much of its cohesion, but nevertheless pressed on despite the torrential fire. According to their doctrine of gore-pour, they fired 2 great volleys into the Russian ranks, then charged with inhuman courage. While the Swedish left wing lagged behind, the Swedish right charged directly into the Russians, sowing confusion in some of their battalions, pushing them back in disorder onto the second line. It seemed like the unbelievably high expectations of the Karelian infantry would repeat the Battle of Narva. However, the slow-moving left only now reached the Russian right wing, which happened to be the strongest concentration of Peter's best troops. Here, the 2nd Battalion of Nerki Värmland and the Ahweta Regiment were taken on their left flank, as the Sieminovsky and Preobrazhensky Guard regiments turned it. All along the line, the Swedish regiments had left large spaces between them in order to meet the larger Russian frontage, which left them in danger of being surrounded individually. Worse was to come for Charles's men. On his left, the Nerki Värmland and Ahweta regiments finally collapsed in the face of the Russian Guards, exposing the flank of the less than 300-strong Uppland regiment. When engaged by the Narvsky and Schusilburgsky regiments, the Upplanders fled in disorder. The entire left wing of the Swedish army followed in their wake. Leeuwenhaupt desperately attempted to rally them, but according to him, not even the devil could make them stand. The Swedish attack was too little, too late. Prince Menshikov moved his dragoons around the southwest and engaged the Swedish cavalry. Amazingly, they sharply held on in the face of overwhelming odds, if for a moment. It was clear, however, that the Swedish army was under threat of being encircled and destroyed as the Russian dragoons in the north moved to complete this strategy. Finally, the Swedish right and center lines were put to rout. Among the infantry, only the Livgarda would conduct an orderly fighting withdrawal, though they too eventually had to run for it. It was not even 11 AM, and the core of the Swedish army, elite veterans of many great victories, had been shattered. Charles, behind the lines on his stretcher, could see very little of the battle unfold. It was only when Rheinfeldt arrived that he learned the infantry had collapsed. The battle had been lost, but it was not the end of the slaughter. The redoubts were still occupied, in part by Russian troops, and these sallied out to chase the fleeing enemy. The only other route of escape lies within the Bodeshinsky woods and the marshes of the Ivanchinchi stream. As the survivors fled, Russian cavalry and Cossacks pursued, supported by artillery fire. The pursuit was close enough that the enemy caught up with the king's entourage. Of 24 stretcher-bearers, 21 would be mown down. As the Russian pursuit slowed from exhaustion, the rest of the army finally fell back, while harassed by Cossacks, to the baggage train at Pushkarvorka. After the battle, Peter held a banquet over the fields of the slain, giving a toast to the enemy and Field Marshal Rheinfeldt, whom he had captured. 6,900 Swedes had been killed or wounded, and 2,800 more were taken prisoner, a figure representing half of the entire army. The Russian losses are estimated at 1,345 killed and over 3,200 wounded, with some accounts claiming up to 5,953 killed or wounded. Now Charles's only option was to flee Russia. With risk of encirclement, the Swedish remnants escaped into Crimea, where Ottoman boats could transport them to safety. On June 30th, the remnants of the Karelians made their way to the banks of the Dnieper. When the first survivors arrived, they found the barren wasteland empty of any timber to make bridges or boats. The decimated army had been trapped. Charles, 300 guards, and his entourage took up all the available boats to safety. Come July 11th, Menshikoff's corps had been detected by pickets further north, arriving sooner than expected. Leeuwenhoek, now in command of the survivors, sought ideas and advice on what to do next. However, no one had anything to answer with. There was simply nothing left to do. At 11 a.m., 20,000 people, including the soldiers' families, servants, Cossacks, and others, surrendered. While most of the Swedish prisoners would be released in 1721, Ivan Mazepa's rebel Cossacks would not be treated as fairly, and thousands more were put to death by the Tsar. All the while, Charles had managed an escape to the Turkish border, where he would remain for years to come. The elite Karelian army had been effectively wiped out, never to be replaced with men of the same caliber ever again. Their king would spend the next few years in exile in the Ottoman Empire, while his nation struggled to survive. However, the Great Northern War would continue for 12 more years, with Charles eventually returning and losing his life at the siege of Fredriksten in 1718. At the end of it all, Sweden's 60-year reign as the supreme Baltic power had come to a close. Peter I, now known as Peter the Great, would bring Russia onto the world stage as a major power. Peter Englund, Swedish author and historian, wrote, "When the long-delayed peace was finally concluded, it signaled the end of the Swedish Imperium. At the same time, more importantly, it confirmed the birth of a new great European power, Russia. This realm was to grow ever greater and more mighty, an empire in the lee of which the Swedes would have to learn to live. In terms of world history, the people of an entire nation had left the stage and taken their seat among the spectators." Thank you to Field Marshal for collaborating with me on this video. You can find more excellent history content on his channel. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment as a sacrifice to the algorithm. You can also support us on Patreon and get ad-free early access to our videos for as little as $1. As always, we'll see you in the next one.